since you entered the office? What unique program, what fresh angles are you bringing to the office?
Yes, so for me it is really important that we look at human rights from a very comprehensive perspective. It is about economic rights, it's about social rights, it's about cultural rights, it's about civil rights, it's about political rights. It is also about the right to development, and it's about the right to environment. And sometimes in the past, there was a tendency to say we only need to do civil and political rights. We don't need to do economic, social and cultural. But that's wrong. We need to do all of it. And we need to do all of it together. And that's really important.
In fact, you just read my mind because the next question was coming. The issue of economic inequality has been actually pushed down the banner. So do you think is something that should be considered a human rights violation and should be taken up after that?
Poverty is a human rights failure.
Yes.
So poverty, people should not be poor. So what happens to the poor is about inequalities, as you say. And these economic inequalities, we see them on all continents, we see them in all societies,
Yes.
and it is really important that we find ways and means that we address them. At the same time, we also have global inequalities. We know that some countries, the industrialized world, has much more financing available than countries in the developing world or in the global south. So human rights is also about rectifying the global inequalities that exist, including on the financial sector.
Yes.
We saw how, many countries in Africa were suffering after COVID, or during COVID and after COVID. We also see how they are affected by the war in Ukraine, because it has affected the economic structures. So it is really very important that we fight for fairer, much fairer financial institutions that deal with the problems that the most vulnerable, especially in the developing world, face.
Now, talking about COVID.
So we, very early on, I think it was even 2 months after the pandemic was declared a pandemic, we issued actually what we call a policy brief. It was a document to the whole world that described how human rights are affected because of the pandemic.
Yes.
And for instance, when emergency legislation was passed, because you could say that because of the pandemic you needed to have some emergency legislation, we always emphasized it has to be targeted, it has to be very circumscribed by the exceptions, and it has to be temporary, and it has to be clearly identified. In some countries, these emergency measures were continued, and they were also used to block civic space and political rights. So we were very worried about it. But let's also not forget, when it comes to the vaccine issue, for example, the vaccine equity issue was a huge one.
Okay.
Because we saw that some countries in the global north were hoarding vaccines. They were keeping the vaccines. So we fought a lot, and it was a human rights issue, that vaccines get distributed all around the world. And it didn't go quick enough.
Thank you. Talking about this region, the whole
I mean, conflict and violence is always extremely bad news for human rights and for people who live in this type of situations. We see that everywhere. I myself, I worked in Kisangani in the Democratic Republic of Congo in '97. So you can imagine that's quite a long time ago. But I saw, and it was basically a civil war situation then. And I can tell you what I saw and the people I met, it marked me because it was very traumatizing. And I can see that's why we need everyone to understand that war and violence are never a solution. And I just hope that, especially in Sudan, that this comes through, that you cannot win any war. No one can win a war. You always lose the legitimacy of the population. So we need and there was a strong initiative by the African Union, silencing the guns.
Yes, yes.
You have
2020.
exactly.
Yes, yes.
Silencing the guns means silencing the guns, because we know that violence and conflict never lead to anything,
Okay.
and it only leads to worse situation for people who are affected by that.
Okay. Now, before you came to Nairobi, you were in Addis Ababa.
Yeah. My office and the National Human Rights Institution of Ethiopia did joint investigations. And we published a report, I think it was about in 21, and there were recommendations that were made. And when the peacefire agreement was signed last year in November, which was extremely welcome because it brought an end to the hostilities, we are now in the process of working on a lot of the follow-up to these recommendations, and both on transitional justice issues, on accountability issues, and I had important discussions with the authorities about that.
Now, still on Ethiopia, for the first time, the world saw that the government side was used.
I have worked in many conflict situations around the world. One of the number one issues is always for the humanitarian agencies to have access. And you need to negotiate it with all the parties to the conflict. So for instance, when I was in DRC, sometimes we had to negotiate it with all the armed groups that were active there and say, look, we need access. Some of them they would give you, other situations they would not. And that's the same in other countries as well. In Syria, it has been an issue. It's been an issue, well, even in Ukraine it is an issue, just to give you the example. So that's an issue that we need to insist, especially for humanitarian activities, to be able to deliver relief and humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian agencies need access, free and unhindered access. Last year, all member states of the United Nations recognized that we have a right, everyone has a right, to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. We still need to make sure that this right gets implemented, because we see with environmental degradation, with climate change, and Kenya is a country that has suffered from drought, has also suffered from sometimes too much rain, which washes things away. It is so important that climate action takes place, that environmental protection takes place, but that we also respect indigenous populations, minority groups, those who are affected by the environment, and that we involve them in the decisions when it comes to whatever they would like to do with a particular situation. So it's really important that everyone is involved in and who is affected by it.
And now we almost finished the last two questions. There's the issue of human, especially child trafficking.
Yes.
Has had an impact on a significant number of millions of people. What is the situation in Africa?
In child trafficking, I mean, you have, for instance, in any conflict situation, trafficking of arms, of illicit substances, and unfortunately also of human beings takes place, both trafficking but also smuggling.
We are also seeing in these two countries trafficking.
Yes, exactly. You see it in Europe, you see it everywhere. Of course, in conflict situations it is more prevalent, it's exacerbated, as you say. In Africa itself, I don't have the numbers, so I can't tell you. But it is definitely an issue where the authorities have to be very vigilant, because sometimes criminal groups benefit from it. And you saw, for instance, in the Boko Haram crisis in Nigeria, I mean, you see that there is a terrorist organization that uses kidnapping, trafficking, organized crime in order to pursue their activities. Yeah.
And finally, we have been